very quickly, a little bit about myself. My name is Psiharis. I'm the Vice President of Business Operations at Clio. And one of the things I spend a lot of my time on at the company is working with our data science team. We've got a team of very, very talented data scientists and analysts who work on a variety of analysis-driven projects. And one of them, since early last year, has been preparing the analysis that goes into the legal trends report. We have a variety of use cases for this data, including, as Jack pointed out, informing ourselves about our own product direction, but of course, also have the opportunity to anonymize and publish this information to all of you. And that's what we're going to be walking through today. I'm planning on doing this in 3 parts. To start, instead of hitting everyone with a bit of a wall of data right off the top, I want to do a bit of an introduction and give a bit of background to what inspired us and what defined our approach in performing the analysis. I'm also very briefly going to talk about the methodology we use to anonymize and aggregate data and prepare it for use in the report. The second section is effectively show me the data. So we'll do a 2017 LTR review. And the third is going to be a bit of an applied session on how to take some of this information and really use it in your practice. The benchmarks are only so good as the decisions we can make from them. And I really want to spend some time walking through a few applied examples that hopefully everyone will find helpful. So you guys have been a pretty quiet audience so far. Does that sound good? Are we on the right track? OK. It's going to be a lot of numbers, so let's get the blood and excitement flowing first. OK, part 1. Let's step into the introduction methodology for today's talk. Last year, we introduced the Legal Trends Report, and in the session I was able to discussed this quote from Peter Drucker: "What gets measured gets managed." This is an idea that's been around from the foundation of management science for a long time. You want to manage something, you got to measure it first, and it's, of course, launched into many of the ways that we do business. It's a good initial concept. Peter Drucker is kind of often referred to as the grandfather of management science and a lot of the stuff that we take for granted today as part of operating organizations in the business world. I kind of think of that as version 1 about thinking of using data to drive decisions. So a great example, I think, of where we see a lot of this is in the sports realm. So everybody knows somebody who's super into sports stats, fantasy leagues, pools, all these stats, players publish all these different things. And those are intended to, of course, live this value. What gets measured gets managed. You measure someone, you're able to tell what their performance level is, where they can improve, and of course, draw out the strategy and tactics of the X's and O's on the board. For this year, something I really took to heart was culture eats strategy for breakfast. Same guy, Peter Drucker, said this too. Sounds delicious. But the concept is the best strategies in the world, even if they are data-driven, don't do the full job and don't replace culture and mindset shifts. Another guy, Jack Newton, who everybody saw earlier today, said that at Clio, our mission is to transform the practice of law for good. And something that I find a key part of transforming the practice of law for good is not just throwing a bunch of data over the fence to all of you. It is to participate in using it to transform the culture of legal in meaningful ways. That's what part of being transformative is not just doing something once, but transforming culture over the long term. And that's a bit of what influenced our thinking in preparing the Legal Trends Report. Now, too often, in my opportunity to travel and meet lots of legal professionals, both in North America and abroad, I think people think about technology transforming law as landing in one place. And that place is kind of here, this bleak, dystopian outlook of robots powered by artificial intelligence replacing lawyers, the end of lawyers, big narrative around, is IBM Watson just going to be the lawyer of the future? I don't say this just because our business model is built off of lawyers being our subscribers and we need them to be around. I say this because I really believe it. I think that what the robots are going to do, what technology is going to do, is make it easier than ever for lawyers to do this, to do what Jack talked about in his keynote earlier today. There's never been a better time to take advantage of technology tools and more or less make the robots, so to speak, work for you to be a better and improved law practice that does a lot of things to serve the needs of your customers. So that's kind of some of the thinking that went into how we thought about preparing the Legal Trends Report today. I think we can look at this as powering improvements and transforming the practice of law in a number of ways. We can have transformed business models that allow lawyers to spend more time on serving their clients and providing legal advice, and less time on much of the overhead that we've talked about before. We can also look at this as changing cost structures and serving a much broader segment of the public. There are many ways in which this transformation can work. So, just to do some recap, I think, of stuff that Jack introduced us to earlier. Where does all of this begin? Well, the first thing we looked at was there is no reliable or kind of competitive data source out there for lawyers, for people interested in legal technology to look for. There are a few surveys that fine folks put work into preparing every year, but their sample sizes are small, and the insights they collect are typically all self-reported. One of the challenges with self-reported information, this is a bit of stats geeking, is that it suffers from social desirability bias. Sometimes self-reported information has some bias applied by the people reporting it. For instance, if you ask people, how tall are they? Or how much do they weigh? Chances are sometimes, I'm only, not you guys, but other people I know, sometimes we'll say a different number than what actually it says on the scale, and that's the way it works. But there are roles for surveying to play, provided that sample sizes are big enough and that questions are structured properly, as we'll see. So that's where we started. And one of the other things we realized was, traditionally, the data we can work from that can inform the profession on what's going on, what trends are changing, how things are evolving over time as we embark on this journey, was traditionally locked up here, right? In offline sources. Everybody's seen one of these. Everybody who's been practicing for a while has made one of these. These are the places where things are stored. But part of what technology is enabling, like it is in many, many other spaces, is connecting the dots. As we mentioned before, there are billions of dollars of revenue information tracked in Clio every year that have trends locked up in them on how things are going. There are places we can send questions and verify hunches that we have on what the state of the profession is and whether or not we are fundamentally making progress toward this mission of transforming the practice of law for good. An analogy I like to use a lot to describe the use case of data and what being data-driven and going through culture change really is one of a navigational compass. Like, the data doesn't answer questions you don't have, or it doesn't magically kind of spit out stuff that's immediately actionable to you, but what it does is it kind of maps the landscape. Right? You can look at a benchmark and think, OK, if I'm heading from here to here, am I making progress? How do I compare versus the map of the landscape that's out ahead of me? And I'm going to circle back on this analogy a couple of times, but I think it's a helpful one for how data can inform decision-making and let you know where you are versus where you're headed. But step one, of course, is doing this with the utmost care for privacy. So part of the reason we haven't been able to publish a report in years past is we needed to get a big enough data store to be able to anonymize and aggregate data safely and respect the privacy guarantees we make to our customers. So I'll very briefly touch on the methodology that goes behind that. In terms of data usage and privacy, everything we extract from our active database is aggregated and anonymized. So we do things in a way that's, first of all, when we do an export of this information, it's not linked to any unique identifiers that belong to our customers. Examples of those would be an email address or the name of a law firm. I can't look at this data set in the way that we extract it and say, oh, this person charged this in this location. That's what anonymization is all about. Aggregation is keeping things at an aggregate enough level that others can't reverse engineer and violate the privacy and the anonymity of a person. So part of the reason we can't go too deep in publishing, for instance, local town level rates is that if we have one customer in that town, and we publish a rate for that town, then we know what that person's rate is. So there's some things that we put in place that are very common in the data science, or what you might call big data realm, that are high priorities for us. The second is that no personally identifiable information, or PII, was used. The third is that in our terms of service, we define this as user content. No content belonging to a law firm client is ever used, extracted, or used in the analysis that we prepare. And then finally, I'll mention that we do give the ability for customers, if they so choose, to opt out of having their data included in the analysis. But of course, my plea to everyone would be to not do that, because we really need this stuff both to inform ourselves on building better technologies for the profession, but also to inform the profession on building a better practice and transforming the practice of law for good. OK, that was the first boring part. The second one, defining our data set. So who's included in the data that we analyze and publish back? We include any paid Clio subscriber. We do this for the contiguous United States only. Those are the areas where we feel we have a big enough data set to meet the previous standards that I mentioned. To be included, someone must have created a matter and relevant billing data in calendar year 2016 for the KPI portion that I'll be walking through. Obviously, as I mentioned before, they must be opted in to the aggregate reporting piece. And finally, we perform what's called systematic outlier exclusion. This is a standard part of stats, but if anything is really crazy and out of whack with the distribution of data we see, we exclude those numbers to get a cleaner result that we publish to everyone. OK, so our next step is putting it all together, designing it nicely, and distributing it to the profession. So from there, we'll launch into part 2 of the presentation, which is what I call Show Me the Data, or the review of the 2017 Legal Trends Report. We saw a few sneak peeks from Jack, and we'll repeat a few of those so people can get them and walk through them again as part of the review. I'll also add that no need to take a lot of screenshots or really go crazy trying to get some of the charts down. We will be making the Legal Trends report available to everyone here through a push notification in the conference app, and then it'll be published online on the Clio website as well. So don't feel the need to kind of absorb it all the first time. I'm going to do a bit of a guided walkthrough, and I certainly invite everyone to do a personal review of the report once they get their hands on it through an electronic copy. OK, so what did we set out to do this year? We had 3 pretty clearly outlined objectives. The first was the case of the missing 6 hours, this utilization rate epiphany we had at the beginning of last year. We wanted to really circle back on that. The second was improving analysis based on feedback we got. So something amazing happened last year where we presented the data to the profession, and I personally got all kinds of feedback, mostly about other stuff that people wanted to see, but also feedback in really important areas that we were excited to kind of have a dialogue on. It's almost like a product, to be honest. Like, people make feature requests, and we process those and put a bunch of them back into the report this year. And finally, we endeavored to provide interesting and new insights, which I think will be the coolest part of the presentation, the one that people will most likely remember the most. Let's get into the first part. So we had this cliffhanger from last year. We basically rolled up and said, lawyers' utilization rates suck. You guys burn 6 hours a day. Jack and I have had some fun periodically referring to this as the holy shit moment from last year. And I think it suffices to cover how most of the feedback I got about it. This is a great conversation starter. I got a lot of feedback about this, including people questioning kind of whether or not an 8-hour workday was appropriate. Turns out we surveyed you, and it's exactly appropriate. So it was good, I promise. So we also hypothesized that there were a couple of reasons folks could have a utilization rate that was lower than they expected. Obviously, the first is that you don't have enough clients to drive enough business to be fully utilized all the time. The second is that you're spending too much time. You have the clients that you need, but you're spending too much time doing non-billable activities and not utilizing your time toward billables appropriately. And of course, the third that I'll throw out there is, for most folks, probably column A, column B, right? There's a mix that we'll see of these things coming up. So where did we embark on? The first thing we looked at was a survey where we were very excited to get over 2,900 responses. This was a survey of law firms. The first question was, where does the time go? Business development came in at 33%, so working on getting new clients. That's kind of the double whammy in that you don't have enough clients and you're spending the time that you could be using toward billable work getting more clients. The second, we kind of grouped together 48% as administrative tasks, broken into things like office administration, generating and sending bills, configuring technology, and collections. The third that I'll mention, and a high use of time, was actually licensing and continuing legal education. So people reported that they spent about 16% of their time on stuff like getting their CLE credits. Some additional insights to accompany these: 69% of people agreed that there's not enough time in the day. 59% of people reported that they struggled to keep track of tasks and deadlines. And interruptions were huge. So 25% of people said they're interrupted more than 10 times a day. 30% of people mentioned that they're interrupted at least 6 times, or between 6 and 10 times. Now, here's something I want everyone to think about. Gloria Mark, who's a professor in the Department of Informatics at UC Irvine, published a study recently where they found that it takes a knowledge worker an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to get back to a task following an interruption. And if folks are getting interrupted as many as 10 times a day, I think we get a pretty clear picture of how these things pile up and can in a very real sense, create a utilization rate like the one that we're reporting. So our next step, on the theme of if I don't have enough clients and would like to understand how to get more, we dove into a survey of consumers, a mix of people who, by the way, have consumed legal services or retained a lawyer in the past, and people who have not. What we found was a pretty big eye-opener on a couple of questions. So the first question we asked is, how do you find a lawyer? How do you look for and search for a lawyer? People were able to pick multiple responses, so if they don't add up to 100%, that would be why. 62% of people said they would look for a lawyer by getting a referral from friend or family. 37% said online search. Another 31% said referral from another lawyer. And finally, 28% said they'd look in a lawyer directory listing. Coming in at the bottom, things like billboards, radio ads, online ads, and TV ads. Clearly not the way that most people think that they're looking for a lawyer and report that they would look for a lawyer if they needed one. This other one was a real eye-opener for me as well. How do you choose a lawyer? So you've looked for a lawyer, but what criteria do you use to select a lawyer? Number one was someone who responds to my call or email right away. The second was offering free initial consults. The third was offering fixed fees, credit cards, exchanging texts, and coming in at the last of the ones we reported was a great-looking website. Something that has swept the business world outside of legal, and many folks might be familiar, is this mania with what's called lead response time. So back in 2007, MIT did a research study with the assistance of a company called InsideSales.com. They found that if you don't get back to your inquiries for new business within the first hour, there's an exponential decrease in the likelihood that they will convert to new business. So I hesitate to ask this question, but how many people here meaningfully get back to every client inquiry they get within the hour? By show of hands. A few folks. What I didn't put in here, so as to be not that scary, is it actually starts declining every 5 minutes as well, so within 5-minute increments. This is a world where people expect their Uber to show up right away, right? And at least for a certain demographic, the sooner you get back to them, the maximum chance you have of converting this customer into a new client. We recognize that this comes with some idiosyncrasies in legal, right? You can't just call anyone and convert them to a client. There's a lot more that goes into someone becoming a good client for a law firm. So in a nutshell, where did we conclude this cliffhanger from last year in our first episode of the next season? Well, how do I get my 6 hours back? I think number one would be respond to your client inquiries as quickly as you can. The second would be minimize the interruptions you get from your existing clients that you're serving in intelligent ways. The third would be obviously streamline and automate as many of those administrative tasks, taking up as much as 50% of your time that's not spent toward billable work. I think the fourth would be investing in managing your reputation and client satisfaction levels in any way you can. And I recognize that some of these things are actually contradictory, right? How can I respond to client inquiries right away and not be interrupted at the same time? Totally agree. What these things all have in common is that there are technology solutions out there to allow you to be more automated in the way that you do them. You can't be on the phone with two people at the same time, but you could be sending one of them an automated email with a form and a calendar booking invite to get them on your calendar and to see if they could be a good client for you while you're in court and not being interrupted. That's what this flywheel that we've pointed to a few times is all about. This is where, if you think about it, the technology / the robots could serve the lawyer as opposed to the other way around. Our next section is addressing everyone's feedback from the 2016 version of the Legal Trends report. We got great feedback and dialogue from just about everybody who read the report, I think. But I wanted to summarize a few key areas that were important and new as part of the report this year. So the first is, in the first version of the report, we published the original 13 practice areas in Clio. So if you set up a matter, there's a default pick list, and those 13 defaults are in there. And the feedback we got from folks was that wasn't expansive enough. There are some unusual practice areas in there, like builder's liens. There's 2 different categories for a conveyance, which most people don't even relate with. So we did something different this year. We used what's called the heuristic to compile the 30 most commonly used practice areas in Clio and bridge things into categories. So what the heuristic would do is match things like landlord-tenant, landlord/tenant, landlord-tenant into one category. And we were able to produce 30 what we call commonly used practice areas at Clio, which is really cool because it's what people are actually saying they're working on as opposed to us using our defaults in the practice areas. The next thing we got was that we were missing key areas and limiting utility to many practitioners. So we kind of matched similar entries and maintained the data aggregation requirement in ways that added a little bit more granularity for folks and made it more useful in ways that we really, really hope will matter, especially on the practice area side. A second area where we got a lot of feedback was on the billable hour index. This is where we plot out what the hourly rates are for those who do hourly work that were being reported. So one piece of feedback was that state-level rates are really helpful. We did our best to use Census Bureau data to divide things into urban and rural. So what the US Census Bureau classifies as urban versus rural rates, and to see how those have gone up and down over time. We also published, as you saw earlier, a billable hour index for the top 10 metropolitan statistical areas, so top 10 metro city areas, because that's where we felt comfortable going to on our data aggregation levels. One other piece of feedback was we mapped rates versus what's called the consumer price index, which is kind of an index of prices over time for basic goods, things like healthcare, food, and shelter, and compared them to hourly rates, which we treat kind of as the price point for legal services. So we were able to break those out more concretely for lawyers, non-lawyers, and then law firms. So there's a blended law firm average rate, there is an attorney rate, and a non-attorney, so other types of fee earners in Clio, and did a much better job of that this year. It was a very highly requested feature. With all that in mind, let's dive in and start our review with the billable hour index. So our first chart, we're going to look at lots of graphs. This is kind of a snapshot taken as of May 2017. The gray line is the US Consumer Price Index, as I mentioned. So you can see a trend of like, what are prices for stuff that I would regularly buy doing over time. The blue line is the lawyer rates. These go back to the beginning of 2012 to show a few years of data. You can see the lawyer rates have kind of mirrored the consumer price index, but of late, maybe even actually outpaced CPI. The blended law firm rate is a bit lower because it works in, obviously, like the overall rates that law firms charge. And interestingly, at the bottom, we have non-lawyer rates, which have stayed remarkably flat for a very long period of time. We're talking about the better part of 5 years of billing data. They've been hovering below or coming up on $150 an hour across the state. So what the averages came in on, of course, law firm rate was $240 an hour, average lawyer rate was around $260 an hour, and the average non-lawyer rate was substantially lower at $149 an hour. That's the average price of legal services in the United States. So it's a good starting point. We also were able to publish information by practice area. So using these new 30 commonly used practice areas that I mentioned, we were able to get rates. This is a chart showing kind of the top 5 and bottom 5 for law firm rates, lawyer rates, and non-lawyer rates. I won't bore everyone by reading them all, but kind of interesting to see that they don't all come in the same. So coming in lower across the board were rates for juvenile law, where we saw obviously much cheaper prices. Coming in at the top, interestingly, were hourly work done for bankruptcy cases, for lawyer rates for immigration cases, and for non-lawyer rates, the highest hourly rates that we saw were actually for traffic offenses. So those are DUI and other traffic infringements. So pretty interesting. And like I said, these will be published in the report. I don't want to kind of hammer everyone with every single data point. I encourage you to read more. The other thing we're able to do is create this cool data visualization where you could see the gray line, which is where the attorney rate ends, the blue line, which is where the law firm rate ends, and the non-attorney line, where you can see where the gray, where the price points end, and break them down by practice area. So I encourage you to go to the report. First thing everybody should do, look up their practice area and, of course, see how they compare. The other thing I mentioned was breaking things out on an urban versus rural divide. So the definition that the Census Bureau publishes of urban is pretty broad, like a lot of what I'd call towns qualify as urban settlements, but it was still interesting to see the divide show very different price points. So the average urban lawyer rate came in at $267 an hour versus $213 an hour for what's classified as a rural location for billable rates. So again, interesting and a new level of granularity, I think, in terms of people benchmarking how their prices compare, of course, as driven by their geographic location. Interestingly, we also saw non-attorney rates come in very similarly in both types of locations, types of settings. OK, we did the top 10 cities by population, and we're able to see one more level of granularity, which we will expand on year over year. For the most part, the top 3 came in terms of population. So New York City rates came in at $344 an hour on average. Second was Los Angeles with $323. Third was Chicago with $312. You can see Miami came in next, $310, $304 in DC, $300 in Dallas versus $276 in Houston, which is an interesting comparison of 2 pretty closely located cities, and then Boston at $287, $245 for Philadelphia. The other thing we published again this year that's really interesting to check out is what we call real hourly rates. So we're able to take cost of living information and adjust the rates in relative terms. So if you adjust like the rates people are charging versus the cost of living in a location, we're able to do this in the state level only. It tells you kind of an interesting story. If you're a new law grad coming out, trying to figure out where you're going to live, where you want to practice, it could be pretty helpful to check something like this out. For the second year in a row, Nevada came in as the best place, and this year it was by actually quite some margin, where cost of living versus our average hourly rates for lawyers have the biggest gap. So cheap place to live in relative terms, and high prices for legal services, which is interesting. I guess a lot of out-of-state people might need legal advice. I wouldn't know about that for reasons unknown in Nevada, and they're willing to pay top dollar to get them, but cost of living stays low. And again, like, I'll invite everyone to go to the report to look at the full graph instead of walking it through line by line. But to summarize a bit, where did we see the largest differences in these real hourly rates? So these are charts showing the top 5 versus bottom 5 states for lawyers. So lawyer rates. Next to that, we have non-lawyer rates. And then the third chart is highest and lowest difference between lawyer and non-lawyer fee earners. The highest versus lowest lawyer rates we saw, no offense to anybody's home state or place where they live, in terms of real rates, again, adjusted for cost of living, Nevada, New York, Connecticut, DC, and California at the top, Kansas, Montana, Iowa, Maine, and West Virginia coming in at the bottom. And where are non-attorney rates closest in terms of real terms to lawyer rates? That would be in smallest differences we saw are at the bottom end of that red chart, so Nebraska, Wisconsin, South Dakota, West Virginia, and Iowa, and the highest differences between those rates, California, DC, Nevada, New York, and Florida. Again, very, very interesting and insight unlike we've ever had into what's going on in terms of billing indices in the legal profession. One other thing I always find really cool is assessing fee structure. So in Clio, we let people track stuff as either hourly, flat fee, or contingency, basic divisions of billable types of billable value. So we take a look at how these things have trended over time. In the first chart here, we've excluded contingency fee settlements altogether and are just comparing hourly versus flat fee. We've seen really, really steady divisions. The blue bars are hourly billable value. The red bars are flat fee billable value, and a divide between them. It came in at around 16% of the billable value in Clio over the course of 2016 being flat fees versus hourly. And that's trended pretty steady over time. It just seems like some practice areas gravitate toward flat fee versus hourly rates. Using our new practice areas, we're also able to see the places where flat fees are, of course, taking the firmest hold. Unsurprisingly, I think, we saw traffic law and traffic-related infringements, immigration come in with a large percentage of flat fees, criminal being highly flat fee driven, and a few other areas like elder law, bankruptcy, and wills and estates. Okay, next one, seasonality. So what we were able to look at is when do people open their matters, like create new cases basically, and divide them by practice area, and then also obviously over the month of the year to look for trends. Like are certain areas of law busier as measured by the number of cases that are being opened at certain points in time. For most practice areas, we see a pretty consistent seasonality trend. February is always a bit of a dip because it has fewer business days, it's a shorter month. Nothing to see there. But the first half of the year tends to be slightly quieter. After summer, things pick up, and then over the holidays, basically post-Thanksgiving, things kind of slow down again, with two exceptions. The first we reported last year, of course, which is tax law. I don't think there are any surprises there that the end of the fiscal year drives a whole bunch of work for tax law firms. The second, bit more of a new thing, was that insurance law in Clio sees a huge spike toward the end of the year. It's the only practice area for which we saw that behavior. So pretty interesting. Somebody's pretty active in insurance law. Let me know. Curious to know what goes on at the end of the year. Next section of data review, law firm KPIs. KPIs stand for key performance indicators. These are your standard, like what gets measured, gets managed pieces in a law firm. And we choose to report 3 of them that are, I think, pretty common in legal, but also very common in billable professional services. So you see these in consulting, you see them in accounting. For CPA firms, for instance, these are all important metrics to those environments. The first we talked about a bit already, and that is utilization rate. This is a measure of the amount of billable time that was worked, so billable hours recorded, versus available hours in the workday. It's a statistical estimate. We don't actually know how many hours everybody can work in a day or how many hours they choose to work, but we structured it around a 40-hour work week, so 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. We compared that against the survey results where we asked people how much they work, and of course there's variability, but the benchmark came in right at 8 hours. So it's kind of our best guess at a utilization rate based on an 8-hour workday. That came in at 29%, which is up from 28% last year. So kind of a win, right? A little bit more billable value, but over such a big data set, it's not a surprise to see things stay pretty steady. The second one is realization rate. So I'll define it quickly, just realization rates can mean different things. What we mean here is the billable value of the amount of time that was recorded divided by the billable value that was actually placed on an invoice. So if there's discounting, if there's like sticker shock phobia taking place where people are like, oh man, I can't put that on the invoice, this is where this step of attrition happens. That came in at 82%. And the final one was collection rate. So of the things that are put out on invoices and put in front of clients, how many things in 2016 or what billable value in 2016 was paid? Too often I talk to practitioners who get really excited about the stuff that's on their invoices, but forget that last step about gotta get paid, right? Until it's paid, it's not done. And it seems high, like 14%, but if you think about a 14% knock on your income just because you're not collecting against work that you've already done, billed, and put through an attrition rate and realization. I mean, this is basically what we get to. So if we look at that, we start with an 8-hour workday. We utilize 2.3 hours of those in a typical day. We have 1.9 hours of that work realized, put on invoices to clients, and that gets us to 1.6 hours that we're really getting paid for. And we look at that and think, there's an opportunity to transform the practice of law for good. There's an opportunity to do better. And the number one place to start is, of course, that huge 6-hour chunk that's put toward non-billable activity. On the topic of KPIs, we do map them out by state. So this is an example of utilization rate by state. We had a spread from around 40% at the high end, which were West Virginia and Maine, straight through to the low 20s, which we saw in Arkansas, in Kentucky, as well as Connecticut. We did the same thing for realization rates. So if you'd like to compare your realization rate versus what's going on in your state, you have the ability to do that here. A bit less of a spread, with the exception of West Virginia at the bottom there. Some serious sticker shock going on in West Virginia, apparently. And we're able to also map these out over the 30 practice areas. Again, I'm not going to read them all out, but do invite everyone to have a look at the report and see that this data is available. Finally, we looked at collection rates, again, both by state and by practice area, and published these. Pretty steady across all the states, with Delaware, Rhode Island, and Wyoming at the top, and looks like New York, West Virginia, DC, Mississippi, and Michigan all at the bottom end of the spectrum, but really not a ton of spread between different states. We see some spread, however, in practice areas when we look at collection rates. So the top collection rates we saw by practice area came in from government, workers' compensation, and intellectual property. At the bottom end of the spectrum, and substantially lower, we saw insurance, bankruptcy, kind of not a surprise, immigration, and small claims, among others. And a bit more of a spread in terms of what practice area you go to and in terms of how much you can expect to collect as a percentage of what you send out on your invoices. Diving into that a bit further, I know it's like the highest performing ratio, but to me, I look at collection rate as one of the areas that's just the most straightforward to try to improve. It's the place that hurts the most. It's the work that you put on an invoice that you didn't get paid for, and it hurts me looking at 86% as a collection rate. So these are the bottom areas as we discussed, and what the rates were, so how much was collected and how much was lost. We took advantage of our law firm survey to ask a few questions here as well. So we asked, what are the top reasons that you don't receive payment or receive late payment? Number one, of course, was, unsurprisingly, that the client lacks the funds to pay. The second was that the client has the money, but still won't pay. Kind of frustrating. A third observation was that 25% of firms primarily rely on mailing their bills. 29% in turn rely on checks as the fundamental way that the primary way, I should say, that they collect payment. The last piece came out of our data analysis, and it's one that I've hammered home before, but firms accepting credit card payments are paid 40% faster over the course of 2016 than firms that don't. And I think this comes back to the whole lemonade stand story, right? You got a credit card, you can pay, give us your payment details. I know that people have some pushback to the fees that they have to pay, but if you compare paying 3% or something on your credit card processing versus 14% of your revenue being lost altogether, from an economist's perspective, that's an absolute no-brainer. And something we'd encourage everyone to consider and experiment with at their own pace. Another area we see a lot of chatter in the legal space is whether or not to use trust accounts, and whether or not to use that process as part of retaining a new client. We looked at the impact trust accounts have on two of these ratios, the realization rate and the collection rate. And in both cases, instances where there was a trust account related, so it's important from a stats geek perspective, this is correlation, not causation, but when people had trust accounts, their realization rates and collection rates were higher. Collection rate makes sense to me. You have the money in hand, so you can transfer it, pay down invoices, so you expect your collection rate possibly to be better. The part that I find really, really interesting, and a bit of a dive into the lawyer's mind, is why realization rates were higher in instances where people had trust accounts and trust funds present. It's like a psychological hack kind of thing. You're more likely to put more of the value on the bill knowing that the client has put money into a trust fund. Again, I can't assume causation and can't confirm that through the data analysis, but a really, really interesting and slightly surprising insight that I think tells us, similar to the fact that the hourly billable hour hasn't altogether died or even changed that much over time, that for practice areas where it's applicable, using trust accounts and going through that process, trust requests with your clients, actually improves financial performance like realization and collection. So let's say you take all that billable value by practice area and divide it by all those matters that were opened in that seasonality graph. Hypothetically, what you could get is the cash value that's collected on average per matter in a practice area. So basically, how much money is a case worth on average? So we took a shot. We took a look at revenue collected. So this is cash in hand, all the way down that funnel we just walked through, on average per case, per matter, and then spelled it out by practice area. So what's interesting here is seeing both the different average values of different practice areas, but also the spreads between these different statistical points. So personal injury is an example. Higher average value, but a median that's way behind. And the reason for that is that it's kind of all or nothing, right? Like it's a gamble. Either you get like a big collected amount, or sometimes you don't. I think it's crucial to understand that in knowing a few key things. So we ran this for a bunch of practice areas. I don't want to take too much time, but I think the first thing you're all going to want to do is go download the legal trends report and look up your practice area and see. There's a lot of information, a bit of a hypothesis behind what our inspiration was to do it. What I think the most important part of the culture transformation piece that I advocated for earlier is using the data to drive decisions. This is the compass piece. You get back to your desk on Monday. George had a bunch of charts. There's a report. What am I going to do? What do I do? How do I start to think about this stuff in the way that I'm proposing? So I thought we'd walk through a few applied examples. We've got 4 of them, and maybe do a test drive, a use case. Number 1, I'll go with the one that's fresh and use an applied example. We have a lot of family lawyers that use Clio. Our estimate, again, it's an estimate based on the information available to us, so the average value of a family law matter in terms of what was collected, like paid, was $3,165. What are some of the things that I can think about using this information for? Well, the top one is this sets a budget for me in terms of what I can spend to acquire a case and still be profitable. If I'm spending more than a small portion of this amount to acquire the client, to onboard them, and then to serve them, then obviously I'm not in good financial shape. But it's a benchmark that lets you compare, first, if you're experiencing similar results to what's being reported, and second, what's my budget to spend, right? What's my absolute ceiling? How much of this am I willing to put into getting a new case? Another thing you can ask yourself is, are the matters you are working comparable to this benchmark? And if not, interesting to explore why. A third question, this is kind of a fun one, is if you did decide to price an alternative fee arrangement, you probably want to start by looking at this benchmark, right? And understanding, am I going to price premium and go above this rate? Am I going to go at this rate to be competitive? Am I going to go below because I'm launching my business and need to pick up clients and get referral business? These are the types of business decisions you can drive, at least inform yourself, because without a benchmark, you're kind of just taking a guess or talking to a few colleagues. But this is a data benchmark collected over billions of dollars of revenue. And when you talk to your colleagues, you still get that social desirability bias having an impact. Another really important thing you can ask yourself is, okay, let's say I think that this estimate is accurate. Set a billing target and understand how many cases you're going to need to work over the course of a year in order to get there. Very simple arithmetic exercise that everyone in this room can do, but at least it gives you like a compass, like a point to start from in terms of making a few of these estimates and building your level of understanding. Example number 2, the efficiency piece. I think a really important thing to do with this time allocation is to try to do your best to estimate where you spend your non-billable time and see if it compares to these categories. Maybe some people are just really awesome or have great referral networks built up and they're not spending 33% of their non-billable time on business development. That could be the case, but if you're spending more, maybe that's a red flag. That's an area to improve on and look at investing in some improvements in. Same thing with administrative tasks. Like maybe the admin stuff you spend your time on doesn't match up directly to these things. If it's out of whack, you can basically educate yourself on what you might need to prioritize in terms of streamlining. I have all these tech tools. Jack talked about this platform with a bajillion things I can integrate with. Which one am I going to do first? Well, kind of take a look at your compass and see, how do you compare? Do I feel like I'm using 16% of my time on office administration, or am I using 50% of my time? If you're out of whack with the benchmark, that's probably the first place to start and get back a few of those billable 6 hours. There are tools that will tackle all of these things. That's the other thing I want to circle back to is there's technology out there, both built into and on top of Clio, that can help you get way better and more streamlined at doing those things. Example number 3 that I wanted to walk us through, acquiring clients. We just had a great presentation on Google Ads. I want to build on some of the topics there. So we saw that referrals from friend or family using an online search engine getting a referral from another lawyer, and looking at a lawyer directory listing where the top reported from clients at least, things that people were looking for in finding a lawyer in the first place. Not in selecting a lawyer, but in finding them. We talked about NPS a little bit. Just as a reminder, NPS is a metric called Net Promoter Score. And what it does is it takes people who are promoters, people who get this question that says, how likely are you to recommend this service to a friend or colleague? And it asks them that on a 10-point scale, 0 to 10. Anybody who says 9 or 10 is treated as a promoter. Anyone who says 7 or 8 is considered a passive. And anyone from 0 to 6 is considered a detractor. You subtract the 9s and 10s, the promoters, from the 0 to 6s, the detractors, and you get a score. But in asking that question, you also get a data point on where somebody's at in terms of whether or not they used your service. What if you realize, hey, I'm not getting enough referrals, or I'm not performing well enough on directory sites? You could choose to isolate the promoters, the 9s and 10s, not worry too much about the score, but just find who they are. And there are a variety of automation tools you can use to do things like get those people, not only refer their friends and family and recommend your service, but go to all the different directory sites where people are also giving reviews and give reviews. That can all be more or less automated through triggers or tools like Zapier, while, again, you're in court or you're running your practice and doing billable work or providing legal advice to your clients, which is what they really need you for. We obviously also really saw some interesting data about how people choose a lawyer. And I threw out there that in the rest of the business world, there's this craze to get to your leads as fast as you can, respond to people and inquiries. Everybody talks about what their lead response time is and gets really excited about it. In communicating with a few of the marketplaces that serve lawyers, the response rate ever is way, way lower than you might expect. I'm not at liberty to disclose the numbers they gave me, but most lawyers don't get back to their inquiries ever. So infinity would be their lead response time, right? And these are leads that they're paying for, right? They're spending marketing budget, they're paying things like Google, they're paying for Google Ads, they're paying for advertisements in other sites that are legal directories. And what most lawyers do is actually don't follow up with people. I'm sure they in many cases have the reasons. They've reviewed it, doesn't look like a fit for me. But if you don't communicate that back to the person and at least respond and kind of do what's called qualification as a process in the sales and marketing world, then they just had a shitty experience. They literally emailed you and you don't care, you never got back to them, you never referred them to somewhere else. That's what I see happening all the time. And for me, if I think about what are the easiest places to start, responding to clients right away, both from a mindset shift, but also from a technology and tools perspective, has never been easier to do. If you think about what you want a robot doing, they're not going to have your client meeting, they're not going to go to court, but they are going to find a way to get people responded to quickly and make sure they feel heard and serviced. And that's a really, really interesting place to start. They're not all robots, of course, but there are some integrations and tools out there. So for instance, Ruby Receptionist. If you're in a small practice, don't have a lot of admin staff who can handle the calls and take the work, you can outsource this function, at the very least make sure someone gets a human voice and gets responded to. You can also use tools like Lexicata, which are about a function called CRM, which is customer relationship management, and streamlining the intake process. A lot of opportunities to use as I'm saying, the robots and make them work for you as opposed to the other way around. The final applied example I want to walk through is seasonality very briefly. Try to track, you can do this in Clio, when you open your matters, right? When the open data is, when did my cases come in, when did I get busy, and map whether or not it's mirroring the trends you see in your practice area. The reason I think it's really important is it shows you if the business you're getting matches the natural business cycle for this type of law and for interest in this type of legal service that's out there. It tells you when you should ramp up your spending on advertising, when things heat up. It tells you when you should expect to be busy and be able to staff a bit more or get part-time help and prepare yourself to do that. It's another place where it's the compass, shows you where you're at in the calendar year, shows you whether or not you're getting busy at the right time, can help you get a bit more control over the business cycle, especially this business development piece, than you might otherwise have. So those are a few applied examples of hopefully taking data and using it. And we'll leave everybody with this in conclusion. Transforming the practice of law for good is about a mindset shift. I think the data is now available. The tools are available. What I challenge everyone in the room to do is to make their mindset available. No one got trained to do this in law school. And we used to walk into environments where this type of training was provided on the job or this type of support was provided in a larger environment, right? The reality is, especially for new grads, but for people of all ages, shapes, and sizes, that they're entrepreneurs and are dealing with the realities of both running their own business, but also consumer demand that is driven by how people buy other stuff and then kind of like placed on legal as an expectation. The best way to get there is to rely on as much technology you can. That's what us like changing Clio is about. That's what us announcing the platform and all these ecosystem integrations are about. And if we do that successfully, I think data-driven lawyers can eat robots for breakfast, which is something I said. That's it. Thank you.